I first became aware of the Adult Learning Knowledge Center in August 2005. That's almost 4 years ago. The Adult Learning Knowledge Center was established following a series of development meetings that took place in Atlantic Canada in the spring and summer of 2005. I remember a tremendous sense of excitement and optimism. For the first time in a very long time, there was a vision around adult learning. And that vision was recognized and validated. It validated the idea that adult learning constitutes a distinctive domain with links to social justice and community building, and that lifelong learning was perceived to have nation-building implications. That's a vision that's really quite extraordinary, I think, and something that is still inspiring for me. This vision, developed and implemented by Dr. Paul Cappon throughout the work of the Canadian Council on Learning, has sustained our work for the last 4 years, and it will continue to nurture the field in the years ahead. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Cappon.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci d'être là. C'est pour moi vraiment un grand plaisir d'être invité à parler lors de votre conférence d'intervenants et de chercheurs dans le domaine de l'apprentissage chez les adultes. Tout d'abord parce que le progrès du Canada et du Québec dans le domaine de l'apprentissage continu, comme Kathleen l'a mentionné, me tient personnellement à cœur. C'est pour cette raison que la création du Centre du savoir sur l'apprentissage chez les adultes était vraiment pour moi un moment à chérir. Le sentiment de satisfaction est encore plus important du fait que cette assemblée se tient à Montréal. Car à plusieurs occasions dans le passé, même si dans le reste du Canada, le domaine de l'éducation des adultes manquait de soutien politique, financier et organisationnel, le Québec est souvent, pas toujours, mais est souvent demeuré un phare où on travaillait de façon fructueuse et de manière inspirante en faveur de l'apprentissage continu. Vivid and emotive is my recollection of the founding conference of the Adult Learning Knowledge Center, which Kathleen has evoked a few years ago. Vivid because of the sense of empowerment that was achieved in so many minds and hearts, the feeling of possibility raised up for people who might previously have apprehended to be on the outside of education systems, peering through glazed, hazy, and sometimes impenetrable windows. Emotive because of the impact in us of the personal stories of learning that we heard, experience that propelled learners to professional and personal success of which they had previously perhaps only dreamed. They were proof positive of the transformative power of learning. Since that time, through your efforts and those of colleagues across Canada, a vibrant network of support for adult learning has sprung up. There are, of course, many more stories of professional success and personal satisfaction for mature Canadian learners. There's also been a landmark national report on prior learning recognition by the Halifax Centre, a contribution not only of high quality and resonance for adult learners, but which also achieves a scope of analysis and international example that should help us chart a national course for portfolio learning. And I find that interesting because what increasingly absorbs me, as it does other people, is the unconscious process of learning. And so that resonates with adult learners as well. I do wish, on this occasion, to seize it really to salute you and your colleagues across Canada who have built, through your commitment, through your passion, through your skills, through your knowledge, the powerful adult learning platform that has been represented by the Adult Learning Knowledge Centers. And I particularly want to recognize four people actually, who helped to build this: Douglas Hodgkinson, and John Biss, Kathleen Flanagan, and Judith Potter, who've worked very, very hard with you and others to make this a success. One of my favorite aphorisms is by the wonderful Canadian humorist Stephen Leacock, who said, I believe very much in luck, and I find that the harder I work, the more luck I have. So in that sense, our colleagues have been lucky because they've worked hard and things have gone very, very well in this center. I've come to think of this field as a million acts of adult learning, each perhaps a small event in the overall scheme of life, yet each contributory in its own way. I recall just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, having been asked by a journalist at the time of this year's launch of the Composite Learning Index, what possible difference to learning could be made by her attendance at the local museum? None at all at first glance, perhaps, I replied, unless you think of all the other similar deeds you undertake as a continuous learner and those of your neighbors and your community. In observing these, you begin to discern the notion of a culture of learning. If we think about the encouraging number of people whose lives have been altered by educational experience later in life, after their initial schooling, then I think we appreciate the transformative power of learning. It is true that some people are, of course, deliberately provocative and even sardonic when it comes to mature learners. A wonderful aphorism by Noel Coward, who said, "I have overeducated myself in all the things that I shouldn't have learned in the first place." Mark Twain, who said, "Never learn anything, because if you never learn, you'll always find somebody else to do it for you." But I think that Cornelius Vanderbilt, the 19th century American, I was going to say robber baron, but actually that's not the expression, capitalist, came closer to the truth when he affirmed, "If I had learned education, I would not have had time to learn anything else." I think that meant that he had learned what he needed to learn later in life. I'm often asked to present and to discuss the important roles of informal education, non-formal education in turbulent economic times, and I will do so shortly because we certainly are in times like that. And yet I must first remind us not only that all epochs are turbulent, but also that the fundamental thrust of a learning culture in the modern world is equally and fundamentally applicable no matter what economic conditions prevail at any particular juncture. On November 14th, 2008, I published on the CCL website a short commentary entitled "The Role of CCL in a Period of Economic Challenges," in which I hoped, in part, to set the stage for renewal of governmental resourcing for continuation of what I think is the unique function of CCL in support of a distinctively Canadian learning culture. And keep in mind, as I quote myself here, that this was at a moment at which swine flu had not yet made its appearance. I wrote, "The world is in transition in so many ways, and the rate of change may appear forbidding to many of us. But one of the welcome challenges is the growing shift from carbon energy to human energy. CCL's work responds to the need for effective development of our country's people, whether Canadian-born or recently arrived in this country. CCL provides evidence for informed decisions by learners and potential learners, by educators and employers, and by governments. Its contributions extend far beyond the short term to build a long-term sustainable advantage for our country. My studies in medicine, which Kathleen referenced with specialization in community health and epidemiology, instilled in me an abiding interest in the history of disease and of humankind's attempts to avert or control illness. The influenza pandemic of 1918-1919 claimed the lives of tens of millions of people around the world. At that time, few resources were available to investigate the dynamics of how disease spread and how to diminish transmission of disease. Had countries had greater resources and a greater capacity to organize a response, the outcomes would have been far less devastating. Think back to the SARS crisis of 2003, and now, of course, the swine flu crisis of this year, which commanded investment of considerable resources in a short time frame to prevent widespread transmission in Canada. My point is this: our society makes valiant efforts to understand the origin of both transmissible and chronic diseases. We invest in agencies such as the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, which gathers information about healthcare services and overall population health. Why do we do this? Because evidence is the key to understanding. And understanding is fundamental to tracking and controlling. And evidence and understanding are the scales on which different and opposing results hang in the balance.